Sweet, that is my presentation. Cool, thank you very much. I get the great honor of being the last speaker today, so I get to say thank you to Johannes and David so much for organizing today. Can we get a round of applause for those guys, please? That's great. Now I've already got you psychologically connecting applause with my presentation as well, so it's a bonus for me. So yeah, today I wanted to talk about AngularJS to Angular, being very, very careful to use the right terminology there, as we've just learned today. We can't call it Angular 1 and Angular 2 anymore. So AngularJS to Angular, and really not focusing on either of those frameworks too much, but rather using it as an example where we can say, how can we successfully go from one piece of software to another piece which is radically different? Because fundamentally, moving from AngularJS to Angular is moving between two very different pieces of software with two very different themes and ideologies and fundamental tech stacks that power them. So just really quickly, oh, there is some lag. I'm going to press the button. Just really quickly on me, I am the front-end lead at a company called Avaset. We make a digital advertising buying tool. I'm a member of the ESLint team. Any ESLint users in today? Yeah. Yes. So many hands went up. Awesome. I'm a collaborator on Ultimate Angular. So this is ultimateangular.com. We run a training website for Angular and TypeScript courses. We have AngularJS, Angular, and TypeScript courses available. You can combine them all into nice bundles to save money and all that kind of stuff. And I do that with my friend Todd, and we're going to be doing some in-person workshops and stuff later on in the year. And you can follow me on Twitter, as usual. So really, we want to think about these huge migrations in terms that are going to be easy for us to digest and keep in our minds as the journey gets a bit rocky. Essentially, the way I like to think about it is that we have a graph, and we have point A and point B on the graph, and there's a big difference between them, but you can think about it in terms of smoothing a curve between them. If we were to zoom all the way in on that graph, we would see all of these different micro movements on the graph, but those are the kind of things that can drive us absolutely insane. We've seen throughout the life cycle of Angular as it was developing, Angular 2 and above, how many breaking changes happened along the way. And fundamentally, those are all low-level APIs that are changing. They're not actual fundamental ideologies of the framework that are changing. It's just APIs. It's living in the changelog is what can really trip you up when we're thinking about these huge migrations. What was clear all the way along was that it was really okay not to have all the answers. Not even the core team could say, this is how you go from AngularJS to Angular. It's still not really an explicit picture even today, because specifically to AngularJS, there wasn't really a common way of writing AngularJS applications. Every AngularJS application was very, very different. And I think finding the right overall approach is definitely the message that I want to get across today. Don't get bogged down in the low-level stuff. I called this talk a survivor's tale, but that's a little bit of a lie because I haven't yet survived it. It still might claim me. I'm currently working with Angular 1 and Angular 2, or AngularJS and Angular side by side in production, and that does work remarkably well, but I haven't actually finished the whole process, so it's still very much something that I'm evolving as an approach and trying to think about these things in high-level themes. And as I said, hopefully this actually maps quite well to any kind of migration of one piece of software to another. So obviously I'm at Angular Beers. I don't really need to spend too long on the history of the different frameworks, but just really quickly, we're obviously talking about AngularJS, which was a radically different project to Angular as we understand it today. Fundamentally, it started off as a server-side project, which became this front-end JavaScript framework, and it had some core beliefs and some core ideas that powered it. It wanted to maintain HTML because it wanted to empower standard workflows between developers and designers and CSS specialists who would want to work with normal markup, but we could sprinkle in some magic syntax, and that would allow us to add our JavaScript functionality on top. The magical two-way data binding ruined my amazing GIF. The magical two-way data binding that was kind of this wow factor that we had going into the framework of being able to type in an input and everything dynamically updating on the page for us became this double-edged sword where we started to build these huge applications and it became very difficult to manage, so the state management tools became more and more important. So we're talking about a time where JavaScript development in general was very, very different to today. JavaScript development in 2010 was a radically different space. We didn't have modules, we didn't have web components, we didn't have these powerful primitives for asynchronous programming such as promises, and testing wasn't really a thing. It wasn't really the kind of thing where you were thinking on my day job, how am I going to do my unit test today? So Angular really tried to solve some of these problems. We don't have modules, so let's have angular.module. Obviously, it's a relatively simple namespace with not a lot of functionality, but it was still looking to solve a problem that existed at that time. We had custom directives to allow us to make up for the fact that we didn't have these web components available to us. We didn't have promises, so AngularJS came up with its own solution for promises. We had the $Q service to allow us to manage some of these asynchronous behaviors in a predictable way. And testing was really something that they wanted to power immediately from day one. Can we make testable JavaScript applications at scale? And tools like Karma and Protractor obviously do that for us. We took these ideas and we absolutely ran with them. We made humongous JavaScript applications. We've deployed Angular everywhere and everywhere, doing all kinds of things that it was never really intended for and never really imagined. We obviously saw an immense change in the landscape, and we started to see all of these different trends to do with build processes and all of these different powerful features coming into JavaScript itself. And the component model and a preference for one-way data binding emerged as the gold standard. We all got JavaScript fatigue, and it was everyone's favorite excuse that we were kind of fatigued by just how many different things sprung up in this short 5-year period. The unfortunate side effect of what tends to happen in this situation is that we feel threatened. We feel inadequate. We feel like there's no possible way to keep up with all of this information. And as a result, we kind of have a primal sense of wanting to join a team and have people around us that have the same beliefs as us, and there's almost an inherent need to therefore attack the choices that others make. Because how could my choice be the right choice if your choice isn't the wrong choice? So I think we've seen this an awful lot while people have been getting to grips with these massive seismic changes in the landscape, and it's not productive at all. We've seen kind of an emphasis just now from the Angular team and the ngconf organizers around, can we promote a community that is not looking to attack each other, it's looking to foster collaboration and creativity amongst groups of individuals, and can we do this in a way where we don't need to kind of attack feature XYZ from framework ABC? Just like AngularJS tried to come to the rescue of some of these lacking features in JavaScript, we've seen Angular come to the rescue of some of these issues around JavaScript fatigue, because it really wants to be the platform that you develop on. It wants to give you absolutely everything out of the box. There's not really anything to be said for or against the particular reasoning, but there are other libraries that decide to give you a very focused approach. They look to do one thing really well, which obviously we know from software development is a really positive thing. But sometimes stitching all of that together yourself on every single project can lead to some of these issues of every project is different. Angular should hopefully address that by giving us so much out of the box. It wants us to develop across all platforms, learn once, apply everywhere. So these are really good ideas when it comes to thinking about migrating from one piece of software to another. If we can think about, okay, the end picture is actually really clear. Even though where I'm coming from was a bit chaotic, we can see a clear picture emerging on the horizon, and if we know where we're going to point B, we can start to work out what the potential paths might be coming back to where we are now at point A. I'm not going to focus too much on kind of more of the benefits of Angular 2, because I think we're up to date on those. The only other thing I wanted to touch on when talking about Angular specifically was how excited I am by the kind of partnerships that we've seen evolve from this process of developing the framework. Because when we look at badges like this, when we see Angular, TypeScript, and React, because obviously Angular does have a renderer for React Native, what we're actually seeing are these logos. We're seeing huge corporations that you might think traditionally were at loggerheads with each other are actually collaborating on producing amazing open source tools that we can all benefit from. So before we move on into actually thinking about more of the practicalities of these migrations, I just wanted to kind of reframe our thinking around who we actually are in these scenarios. And this is one of my favorite images of all time. We are stakeholders. We are not just techies, architects, developers, engineers. We are stakeholders in our businesses and in the culture of our businesses. There are decisions that we make on a daily basis that affect the culture and the kind of environment that we're creating in our place of work. We can have a great influence on the overall morale and the overall kind of direction of a particular business if we can think about ourselves in that role. The decision whether or not to move to Angular 2 is a business decision fundamentally. We have to think about it as our jobs, how we're going to implement it from a technical perspective, but it's a business decision at the end of the day, and there will be costs associated with it. The argument that I really want to make today, the core message, is that identifying and implementing high-level patterns early could be the difference between a gradual migration and a complete rewrite. When you start to think about the problems in this high-level way, and it's something that we do actually struggle with, I think, particularly I do when I'm thinking about problems from a technical perspective. I just want to dive in and I want to get my hands dirty and I want to think about, oh, there's a new way I can write this kind of function syntax or that kind of stuff. But if we start thinking about it in this way, we're actually really putting on a manager's hat. We're thinking about it in terms of how do we have an impact on the business, on the bottom line. And when we start behaving in that way, we'll actually find that we have a great deal of common ground with our managers. Our managers might be fairly implicit and situational. For example, they might be a product manager or a project manager for a particular effort that we're on there. Or they might be a very literal manager, somebody that we report into year-round who kind of looks after us in the business. But if we start thinking about it in this way, we can actually identify the gap that exists between us in our specialities. Our managers are hopefully very smart, very motivated, very passionate people, but they have different specialisms to us. Their concerns are entirely real, but they're very different from ours. If we think about their concerns and we're showing empathy to them, we'll find that our meetings are just so much more straightforward because we've come the extra distance. We've come more than 50% towards them. Any insecurities they have about not feeling technical enough is what we can fill in the gaps for them for, and they will feel empowered, and I've put smarter here. It's nothing to do with intelligence. They'll just feel much more connected to the problem set that we're bringing to them. So how do we get from A to B? I think, as I've said before, and I really want to hammer it home, talking about changelog level changes is really how we get trapped into thinking, for example, moving from A to B is impossible. We can't move from AngularJS to Angular. It's too different. We're going to have to start again. What we really should be thinking about instead is what are the differences in environments? What are the differences in tooling? So for example, in AngularJS and Angular, we could well be coming from a world where we served up our entire application via script tags on an HTML page. That would be entirely reasonable to do in an AngularJS application. Our bootstrapping process might have been done one way through an attribute on the HTML tag. We'll look at a specific example of that in a second. But when we're moving towards the picture on the horizon, B, we know that Angular fundamentally has a whole build tool chain around it. There's lots and lots of different tools that are brought together in some form of build process. So we managed to identify a very high level difference between our two situations. And therefore, we can think about, can we actually get back from B to A? Are there things that we could do today to change A to be more like B without actually having migrated anything? So let's look specifically at that Angular migration. We need a build process. We're going to need something to transform our input into our output and serve that to our users. It's no longer a case of just putting a script tag on a page and we have our whole application. We know that Angular works best with TypeScript. I saw somebody tweeting today that Angular technically doesn't need TypeScript in the same way that a car technically doesn't need brakes. It would work just fine without it, but you're going to have a much harder time. So migrating to TypeScript, that's actually got nothing to do with Angular. We could migrate to TypeScript today, or we could at least start thinking about how that's going to fit in. Again, but we haven't yet needed to worry about how do the APIs between the frameworks change. We're just thinking about the tooling that is involved in the migration. Best practices. How can we think about best practices from B coming back to A? We have best practices around dumb components or presentational or leaf components, being components that just receive inputs and produce outputs. We've heard many examples of those today. And the idea of one-way data flow flowing through application. Obviously great to follow up on that talk about NGRX store. These are the kind of things which we didn't really do in AngularJS because we didn't really have any best practices around them, but they are doable. We can actually achieve these different best practices today. And when we talk about overall architecture, there are also some dedicated tools to help us along that journey. We have things like ng metadata by some Czech guy.
I'm from Slovakia.
Some Slovakian guy. And that allows us to write our Angular 1 code in a way that resembles our Angular 2 code incredibly strongly. It's not hacking around at the core APIs of Angular, but it means that we can move our code so that it looks very much like our Angular 2 code and benefits from all of the type checking of TypeScript, but we're not needing to actually fundamentally change what's under the hood. And then finally, when we're really just at that point where we're going to migrate, the Angular team themselves have provided Angular Upgrade, which will give us APIs to help us switch between two different versions of the framework. So let's have a look at a specific example then. We're dealing with AngularJS. So, can you see that right? Yeah. We could bootstrap our application like this. We could serve AngularJS as a script tag on the page, and we could bootstrap it through the ng app directive. This is perfectly fine. But we could also bootstrap our application by having a TypeScript file which imports Angular from our node modules directory, and we call the bootstrap method on the Angular object, passing in the name of our application, my app, instead of using the ng app directive. Nothing about our AngularJS application has changed for any of our users, but we've changed the methodology behind how we've set it up. We've gone a quantum leap closer to how Angular 2 works, where we're going to need to import items from the framework and call a bootstrap function to set up our application. Our paradigms are now aligned. We can also think about those in terms of the ng metadata example. So even this is a bit of a leap. Some AngularJS applications won't be using the component helper from Angular 1.5. But let's say that we are creating a foo component using the component helper. We have our template and we have our controller, which contains a reference to some properties. If we use ng metadata, which resembles the patterns of Angular 2, we can import a component decorator from ng metadata. We can annotate a class with that decorator. We can pass in an object into that decorator factory function to actually set these properties as metadata on our class in exactly the same way as we would do for an Angular 2 application. The only thing you would then need to do to take this ng metadata code and turn it into Angular code is change our import statement to import from @AngularCore and remove the $controller reference inside our template because the template properties are bound automatically for us in Angular 2. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions, and we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves for not having all the answers. It's going to depend very much on where we're coming from, but we can work out exactly where we're going to and work backwards from there. It's always going to be trade-offs to the decisions we make on how deep do we go on these migration paths. ng metadata is a fantastic tool, which as you can see gets us incredibly close to how we would write our Angular 2 applications, but maybe that's overkill. Maybe you have a lot of resources available to you on your development team, or maybe you have a small application, and so rewriting at scale relative to your application might be a valid option for you. For example, for me, I had to live for a very, very long time with AngularJS and Angular side by side. So I was running both AngularJS components and Angular components side by side, because there just wasn't the scope on the team to be reinventing components alongside new features. Back to my message then for the day. Identifying and implementing high-level patterns early could mean the difference between an incremental refactor and a total rewrite. The key thing is not getting lost in the changelog and identifying these high-level patterns that we can work backwards from the end goal. Thank you very much.